She arrived on England's shores as a child of 12, a creature of porcelain and silk, her value measured not in spirit or intellect, but in the purity of her Valois blood and the weight of the French alliance she embodied. She was Isabella, daughter of the formidable King Philip the Fair of France, a princess bred in a court of unparalleled sophistication and whispered ruthlessness. She was meant to be a queen, a symbol, a vessel for future kings. But history, in its cruel and ironic fashion, would remember her by a different name, one spat with a mixture of terror and awe, the she-wolf of France. It is a name that conjures images of rapacious ambition, of unnatural cruelty, a woman who tore down a king, her own husband, and plunged a realm into chaos. But this narrative, the one etched into the popular imagination, is a dangerously simple one. It forgets the girl. It ignores the years of quiet degradation, the public humiliation, and a systematic stripping away of dignity that must occur before a lamb can be forged into a wolf. How does a 12-year-old pawn in the grand chess game of European diplomacy become the queen who checkmates her own king? The answer is not found in simple ambition, but in a long and agonizing education in the brutal realities of power, an education delivered at the hands of the very man she was sworn to honor. This is not merely the story of a vengeful wife or a power-hungry adulteress. It is the story of a survivor. It is the chronicle of a political and psychological transformation born from the crucible of neglect and contempt. To understand Isabella's eventual bloody rise, one must first understand the depths of her fall, a descent that began the very moment she stepped into the glittering, treacherous world of the English court. We will trace the slow poisoning of her marriage, the calculated isolation she endured, and the relentless pressure that eventually caused the delicate facade of the medieval queen to crack, revealing the hardened survivor beneath. Her story is a chilling testament to the fact that those who are shown no mercy will often learn to show none in return. It poses a timeless and unsettling question. When a victim, pushed beyond all endurance, seizes power and wields it with the same brutality that was once used against them, do they become a monster, or do they simply become a mirror to their tormentors? Isabella's genesis was in a court that understood power in its most elemental forms. Her father, Philip IV of France, was known as Le Bel, the Fair, for his handsome features, but his reign was anything but gentle. He was a king of iron will, a centralizing monarch who crushed the Knights Templar, expelled the Jews to seize their assets, and engaged in a bitter and ultimately successful struggle for supremacy against the papacy. The French court of the early 14th century was a place of immense wealth, cultural brilliance, and lethal political maneuvering. This was Isabella's nursery. She was not a naive country girl. She was a princess who had observed the mechanics of absolute authority from her earliest days. She understood that a monarch's favor was the sun in which courtiers basked, and his displeasure was a killing frost. She was beautiful, intelligent, and by all accounts, possessed a grace that captivated those who met her. She was the perfect diplomatic instrument, meticulously crafted to seal a fragile peace between France and England, two nations perpetually circling each other like wary predators. The role of a medieval queen was a gilded cage, defined by a rigid set of expectations. Her primary function was dynastic. She was to produce a male heir, securing the line of succession. Her second function was diplomatic. She was a living, breathing embodiment of an alliance, a constant reminder of the political bonds between her native land and her new one. She was expected to be pious, demure, and a patron of the arts, a softening influence on the masculine world of governance and warfare. Her personal happiness was a consideration so remote as to be irrelevant. She was property of the state, her body a vessel for its ambitions. The English court she was about to enter was a landscape of competing interests, a web of ancient noble families, the Lancasters, the Mortimers, the Bohuns, all jealously guarding their own power and privileges against an encroaching crown. It was into this viper's nest that the 12-year-old Isabella was thrown, armed with her beauty, her lineage, and a treaty that bound her to a man she had never met. The marriage to King Edward II of England was celebrated with all the magnificent pomp and ceremony the age could muster. On January 25, 1308, in Boulogne, Isabella of France became Queen of England. She was a vision of youthful promise, draped in fabrics that shimmered with gold thread. Edward II, tall and famously handsome, looked the part of the powerful Plantagenet king. To the outside world, it was a perfect union, the healing of old wounds between two great kingdoms. But the rot, the source of a poison that would contaminate the entire reign, was present from the very first day. At the wedding feast, a profound and public humiliation was delivered to the new queen. Edward, her husband, the King of England, spent the evening lavishing his attention not on his new bride, but on a man named Piers Gaveston. Piers Gaveston, a Gascon knight of relatively humble birth, was the all-consuming passion of Edward II's life. He was witty, arrogant, and possessed a hold over the king that was absolute and, to the English nobility, utterly scandalous. Edward had been forced to exile Gaveston before, but with the death of his formidable father, Edward I, one of his first acts was to recall him. At his own wedding feast, Edward seated Gaveston in a place of honor above the queen's own kinsmen, showering him with affection and conversation while his child bride sat in stunned silence. Worse still, chroniclers reported with outrage that the magnificent jewels and gifts Isabella had brought from France as part of her dowry were almost immediately gifted by Edward to his favorite. It was a breathtaking insult, a public declaration that the Queen of England, the daughter of the King of France, ranked second in the king's heart to a provincial knight. The political alliance she represented was secondary to a personal infatuation. This was her welcome to England. Her cage was not merely gilded. It was, from the beginning, cold and empty. The humiliation at her wedding was not an isolated incident. It was the overture to a symphony of neglect. The relationship between Edward and Gaveston was the central political fact of the early reign, and Isabella was its primary collateral victim. Gaveston, emboldened by the king's obsessive favor, treated the court as his personal playground. He was notorious for bestowing insulting, effeminate nicknames on the great magnates of the realm, mocking their appearances and martial prowess. He called the powerful Earl of Warwick the Black Dog of Arden, and the Earl of Lancaster the Fiddler. While this earned him the mortal hatred of the baronage, his attitude toward the young queen was perhaps even more damaging. He saw her not as his sovereign lady, but as a rival for the king's affections and resources. The court revolved around the king and his favorite, leaving Isabella isolated and politically impotent. Her French household, the familiar faces she had brought with her for comfort, were often dismissed or sidelined, replaced by Gaveston's own appointees. She was a stranger in a strange land, married to a man who, at best, was indifferent to her, and at worst, seemed to view her as an inconvenient appendage to his kingship. This was a critical turning point, the first major catalyst in Isabella's transformation. A young girl, raised to believe she was the pinnacle of female aristocracy, was being treated as a negligible quantity. Her complaints to her father, Philip the Fair, are a matter of historical record. Through emissaries, she spoke of her poverty as the king diverted her rightful revenues to Gaveston, and of her loneliness as her husband preferred the company of his favorite above all others. On the most miserable of wives, one chronicle reports her saying, Philip of France, a king not known for his sentimentality, took these complaints seriously, not because he cared for his daughter's happiness, but because an insult to his daughter was an insult to the crown of France and a threat to the stability of the alliance he had so carefully constructed. He put pressure on Edward, but the English king was deaf to all criticism where Gaveston was concerned. The situation festered, creating a dangerous rift not just within the marriage, but between the King of England and his own nobility, who saw Gaveston's influence as a threat to the very fabric of the kingdom. They formed a powerful opposition, the Lords Ordainers, demanding reforms and, most urgently, the the permanent exile of Piers Gaveston. For Isabella, the baron's animosity towards Gaveston created a strange and temporary alignment of interests. They despised the man who held her husband's heart, and so did she, albeit for different reasons. Theirs was a political and social outrage. Hers was a deep and personal wound. The struggle culminated in 1312. The barons, led by the formidable Thomas, Earl of Lancaster, defied the king, captured Gaveston, and after a summary trial, had him unceremoniously executed on Blacklow Hill. The Black Dog of Arden had his revenge. Gaveston was run through with a sword and beheaded. For Edward, it was a cataclysm, the defining trauma of his life. He would never forgive the men responsible. For Isabella, it must have been a moment of profound and complex emotion. The source of her public shame was gone. The obstacle between her and her husband had been violently removed. A period of apparent reconciliation followed. Edward, shattered by his loss, seemed to turn to his wife for comfort. For a brief, fleeting period, the marriage functioned as it was supposed to. In November of 1312, 9 months after Gaveston's death, Isabella gave birth to a son, the future Edward III. She had done her duty. She had provided an heir. For a time, it seemed that the crisis had passed, that she could settle into the conventional role of queen and mother. But the vacuum left by Gaveston would not remain empty for long. Edward II's fundamental nature had not changed. He was a king who needed to be guided, who craved a singular, trusted confidant to whom he could outsource the tedious business of governance, and on whom he could lavish his affections. The death of Gaveston had taught him a terrible lesson, not about the dangers of favoritism, but about the ruthlessness of his enemies. He needed a protector, a champion, someone more cunning and politically astute than Gaveston had ever been. He found these qualities, and more, in a new set of favorites: Hugh Despenser the elder and, more significantly, his son, Hugh Despenser the younger. This was the second, and far more sinister, turning point. If Gaveston had been an arrogant nuisance, the Despensers were systematic predators. They were avaricious, power-hungry, and possessed a genius for administration that they applied with terrifying efficiency to the task of enriching themselves and crushing all opposition. Their rise marked the beginning of a new and far darker chapter for Isabella and for England. The Despensers' consolidation of power was methodical and relentless. Hugh the Younger, in particular, established a psychological and political dominance over Edward that dwarfed even Gaveston's. He was not just a favorite. He was a co-ruler, an alter ego. Unlike Gaveston, whose primary sin was arrogance, the Despensers was an insatiable greed. They used their position to amass a vast network of lands and properties across England and Wales, often through blackmail, legal chicanery, and brute force. They were universally hated, seen as cancerous growths on the body politic. For Isabella, their ascendancy was a catastrophe far exceeding her earlier humiliations. The Despensers recognized her as a potential rival power center, a symbol of an alternative court, and they moved with cold precision to neutralize her completely. This was not the casual neglect of the Gaveston years. This was a calculated campaign of political and psychological isolation. The development of this new crisis was swift and brutal. In 1321, a coalition of barons, known as the Contrariants, rebelled against the Despensers' overreach, forcing the king to exile them. It was a brief victory. Edward, with Hugh the Younger's strategic guidance, rallied his forces. In 1322, at the Battle of Boroughbridge, the baronial opposition was utterly crushed. Thomas of Lancaster, the king's cousin and the man who had led the charge against Gaveston, was captured and subjected to a humiliating show trial before being brutally executed. This victory untethered the king and the Despensers from all restraint. England descended into a period of tyranny. Lands were confiscated, enemies were imprisoned or executed, and a climate of fear permeated the court. It was in this oppressive atmosphere that the full force of the Despensers' animosity was turned on Queen Isabella. Her life became a prison. Hugh Despenser the Younger, paranoid and controlling, saw her French origins as a potential threat. He began to systematically dismantle her life. He engineered the dismissal of her loyal household staff, replacing them with his own spies who reported her every word and action. He persuaded the king that Isabella could not be trusted, playing on Edward's insecurities and his grief over Gaveston, which Despenser likely blamed in part on the queen's complaints to her father. In 1324, when war broke out again between England and France over territory in Gascony, the Despensers seized their chance. They declared the queen, a French princess, to be a potential enemy agent. On their advice, Edward II committed an act of astonishing cruelty and political stupidity. He confiscated all of Isabella's lands and revenues, placing her under what amounted to house arrest. More devastatingly, he took her children, the heir to the throne, Prince Edward and his sisters, from her custody and placed them under the guardianship of the Despensers. This was the ultimate violation. They had taken her property, her freedom of movement, and her trusted servants. Now, they had taken her children. For a medieval queen, whose entire identity and security were tied to her role as mother of the heir, this was an existential threat. It was a clear and unambiguous message. You are nothing. You are powerless. You are a prisoner. She was subjected to a daily allowance that was less than that of a minor courtier, a calculated humiliation designed to break her spirit. The psychological toll must have been immense. The vibrant, intelligent princess from the most powerful court in Europe was now a pauper in her own home, watched constantly by her enemies, separated from her children, and married to a man who was a willing accomplice in her degradation. Her attempts to appeal to Edward were futile. He was a puppet, and Hugh Despenser was the puppet master. She was trapped, with no allies in England left to turn to. The barons were crushed, the court was terrified, and the king was her enemy. There was only one path left, a desperate gamble that led back to where she began, France. The opportunity came disguised as a diplomatic mission. The simmering war with France needed a resolution. Pope John XXII suggested that Queen Isabella, as the sister of the French king, Charles IV, would be the ideal emissary to broker a peace treaty. For the Despensers, it must have seemed like a perfect solution. Sending her to Paris would remove her from the English court, placing her conveniently out of sight and out of mind. They likely believed she would be as powerless in her brother's court as she was in her husband's. It was a catastrophic miscalculation, perhaps the single greatest political blunder of their rapacious careers. They had cornered an intelligent, proud, and deeply wronged woman for years, subjecting her to relentless pressure. They failed to understand that such pressure does not always crush. Sometimes it creates diamonds. Or, in Isabella's case, it sharpens steel. In March 1325, with Edward's permission, Queen Isabella sailed for France. She was, in theory, acting as her husband's loyal envoy. In reality, she was escaping, and she had no intention of ever returning until she could do so on her own terms. Once on French soil, Isabella was transformed. The frightened, isolated prisoner of the English court was suddenly the cherished sister of the King of France. She was back in her element, surrounded by the power and prestige of the Valois dynasty. She quickly and skillfully negotiated a peace treaty, but with a crucial condition. The young Prince Edward, Duke of Aquitaine, must come to Paris to pay homage to King Charles for his French territories. Edward II and the Despensers, desperate to avoid a full-scale war, agreed. They sent the 13-year-old heir to the throne across the Channel and directly into the hands of his mother. It was the checkmate move in a game the Despensers hadn't even realized they were playing. With the heir to the throne at her side, Isabella was no longer just a disgruntled queen. She was the figurehead of a legitimate alternative government. She now had the one thing she needed to challenge the Despenser regime, the future king. With her son secured, Isabella dropped all pretense of diplomacy. She publicly refused to return to England as long as Hugh Despenser remained at her husband's side. She issued a powerful statement, declaring, "I feel that marriage is a joining of a man and a woman, and that someone has come between my husband and myself, and is trying to break this bond. I declare that I will not return until this intruder is removed. The intruder was Despenser. Her court in Paris became a magnet for all of Edward II exiled and disaffected enemies. The most important of these was Roger Mortimer, a powerful and charismatic marcher lord who had been a leader of the Contrariant Rebellion. Mortimer had been imprisoned in the Tower of London and sentenced to death, but he had managed a daring escape and fled to France. He and Isabella, two people who had both lost everything to the Despensers, found common cause. Their shared grievance soon blossomed into a political alliance, and almost certainly a passionate love affair. Together, Isabella the Queen and Mortimer the Warrior began to plot the unthinkable, an invasion of England. The climax of years of suffering and planning arrived in September 1326. Isabella, having secured funds and a small mercenary army from the Count of Hainaut by betrothing her son Edward to the Count's daughter, set sail for England. It was an audacious, almost suicidal gamble. Her force was tiny, a few hundred soldiers at most. But she was not counting on military might alone. She was counting on the seething resentment of an entire kingdom. She was counting on the fact that England was a tinderbox of hatred for the Despensers, and she was about to provide the spark. She landed, unopposed, on the Suffolk coast and issued a proclamation. She had come, she said, not to make war on her husband the king, but to destroy the traitor Hugh Despenser and to restore the rightful liberties of the kingdom. It was a work of political genius. She positioned herself not as a foreign invader, but as a liberator. The result was instantaneous and spectacular. The regime did not fight, it simply dissolved. The kingdom collapsed like a house of cards. Key nobles, including the king's own half-brothers, the Earls of Norfolk and Kent, immediately defected to her side. London rose up in her favor, capturing and lynching the Despensers' key allies. The speed of the collapse was a stunning indictment of the tyranny that Edward and his favorites had imposed. The people of England did not see a rebellious queen. They saw a savior. Isabella, no longer the weeping victim, was now at the head of a popular uprising, a warrior queen marching triumphantly across her kingdom. Edward II and the Despensers, abandoned by all, fled westward in a panic, desperately trying to raise troops in their Welsh heartlands. But it was no use. Their power, built on fear, evaporated the moment the fear was gone. The endgame was swift and merciless. Edward and Hugh Despenser the Younger were captured in Wales in mid-November. The king was taken into custody and held at Kenilworth Castle. For Despenser, there would be no such dignified captivity. Isabella and Mortimer, now the de facto rulers of England, were determined to make an example of him. His execution was to be a piece of carefully orchestrated political theater, a gruesome spectacle designed to satisfy the public's thirst for vengeance and to symbolically cleanse the realm of his corruption. On November 24th, 1326, Hugh Despenser the Younger was brought to trial in Hereford. The verdict was a foregone conclusion. He was condemned as a traitor and a heretic. The sentence was designed to be the ultimate degradation. He was dragged through the streets, tied to a horse. He was publicly hanged, but cut down while still alive. Then, in front of a cheering crowd, his genitals were cut off and burned before his eyes, because he was judged a heretic and a sodomite who had led the king astray. Finally, his entrails were pulled out and burned, a punishment for having sown discord in the realm. His heart was cut out and thrown into the fire. Only then was he beheaded, and his body quartered, the pieces sent to be displayed in the major cities of England. It was an act of horrific, calculated brutality, a clear message that the old regime was not just over, but had been ritually annihilated. Isabella, the woman they had sought to destroy, had presided over their utter destruction. With Despenser eliminated in the most barbaric fashion imaginable, the question of King Edward II remained. He was the anointed king, a sacred figure. To simply murder him was politically and theologically dangerous. The solution devised by Isabella and Mortimer was radical and unprecedented in English history. In January 1327, a parliament was convened. There, through a combination of threats and political pressure, Edward II was formally deposed. A delegation was sent to him at Kenilworth, where they presented him with the charges against him: incompetence, the loss of Scotland, oppression of the church, and above all, rule through a wicked favorite in defiance of the counsel of his great lords. In a scene of high drama, Edward, weeping and dressed in black, agreed to abdicate the throne in favor of his 14-year-old son. Young Edward III was crowned, but the power remained firmly in the hands of his mother, Isabella, and her lover, Roger Mortimer. They were now the regents, the rulers of England in all but name. But the specter of the deposed king still lingered. As long as Edward II lived, he was a potential rallying point for any future opposition. He was moved from Kenilworth to the more secure and remote Berkeley Castle, under the guardianship of men loyal to Mortimer. What happened next is one of the most enduring and gruesome mysteries in English history. In September of 1327, it was announced that the former king had died. The official cause was given as natural causes, that he had simply expired from a long-standing ailment. His body was embalmed and put on public display in Gloucester Cathedral to quell any rumors, and he was given a magnificent royal funeral. But almost no one believed the official story. A king who was healthy one week does not simply die the next. Rumors began to spread immediately, rumors of a horrific and symbolic murder. The most infamous of these tales, which emerged years later, claimed that Edward was held down and killed by having a red-hot poker inserted into his anus, a method that would leave no external marks of violence and would be a hideous, symbolic punishment for his perceived sin of sodomy with Gaveston and Despenser. Whether this specific grisly story is true is a matter of intense historical debate. It may well have been later propaganda designed to further blacken the names of Isabella and Mortimer. But the truth is almost certainly that Edward II was murdered on their orders. He was too great a liability to be left alive. The regency of the she-wolf and her partner was born in rebellion and secured by regicide. For 3 years, they ruled England. They consolidated their power, rewarding their followers and punishing their enemies. Mortimer, in particular, grew as arrogant and greedy as the Despensers before him. He took the title Earl of March and lived in a state of quasi-royal splendor, accumulating vast estates and alienating the very nobility that had helped him rise. Isabella, seemingly blinded by her affection for him and her enjoyment of her newfound power, allowed his excesses to go unchecked. They signed the Treaty of Northampton with Scotland, formally recognizing Robert the Bruce as king and abandoning England's claims, a move seen by many as a national humiliation. The liberators were beginning to look very much like the tyrants they had replaced. The final act of their reign demonstrated their paranoia. Edmund, Earl of Kent, the late king's own half-brother who had initially supported Isabella's invasion, became convinced by a conspiracy that Edward II was still alive and being held captive. He plotted to rescue him. It was a trap, likely laid by Mortimer himself. Kent was arrested, tried for treason, and sentenced to death. His execution in March 1330 was a sordid affair. He was a popular royal duke, and no executioner in Winchester could be found to do the deed. Eventually, a condemned prisoner was offered a pardon to take up the axe and behead the earl. This act of cold-bloodedly executing a member of the royal family for a deluded plot was the final straw. It horrified the young king, Edward III. He was now 17, no longer a child to be manipulated. He was a proud Plantagenet, resentful of his mother's lover who ruled in his name and who had stained the crown with blood and dishonor. The wheel of fortune was about to turn one last time. In October 1330, Edward III, with a small group of loyal companions, staged a daring coup. Using a secret tunnel, they entered Nottingham Castle, where Isabella and Mortimer were staying. They burst into the royal chambers, overpowering Mortimer's guards. Isabella famously pleaded with her son, "Fair son, have pity on the gentle Mortimer." Her pleas were ignored. Roger Mortimer was arrested, taken to London, and condemned to death by Parliament without a proper trial, accused of the same crimes of treason and illegal power he had once leveled against Despenser. On November 29, 1330, he was hanged, drawn, and quartered at Tyburn. The reign of Isabella and Mortimer was over. The young king had claimed his kingdom. Now, all eyes turned to the queen mother, the she-wolf. What would a son do with a mother who had overthrown his father, taken a lover, and ruled as a tyrant? By the brutal logic of the age, execution seemed a distinct possibility. She had, after all, presided over a rebellion and the deposition and likely murder of his father. But Edward III was a different kind of man from his predecessors. Perhaps he recalled the genuine affection she had shown him in Paris, or perhaps he understood the years of torment she had endured at his father's hands. He chose not vengeance, but a quiet and merciful suppression. Isabella was not executed, nor was she imprisoned in some dank cell to lose her mind, as later myths would claim. She was sent into a comfortable and luxurious retirement. For the next 27 years, the woman who had shaken a kingdom to its foundations lived the life of a wealthy dowager queen. She was stripped of the vast estates she and Mortimer had accumulated, but she was given a generous income in her own castles, primarily Castle Rising in Norfolk. Historical records paint a picture not of a mad, screaming prisoner, but of a woman who managed her affairs with skill, enjoyed falconry, collected religious relics, listened to minstrels, and doted on her grandchildren. She was occasionally welcomed back to court by her son for major festivals and family events. The she-wolf had been defanged, her claws clipped. The fire that had driven her to conquer a kingdom had been banked, leaving behind the quiet embers of a life lived in opulence and political obscurity. She took the habit of the Poor Clares shortly before her death in 1358 and was buried in London. Poignantly, and perhaps as a final, private admission of the complex truths of her life, she was said to have requested that the heart of her murdered husband, Edward II, which she had kept for 3 decades, be buried with her. So what is the final judgment on Isabella of France? Was she the monstrous she-wolf of legend, a faithless wife and a cruel usurper? Or was she a product of her circumstances, a survivor forged in the fires of humiliation? The truth, as is so often the case, is far more complex than the caricature. She was, without question, ruthless. She orchestrated a rebellion, sanctioned a horrific public execution, and was almost certainly complicit in the murder of her husband. Yet these actions did not arise from a vacuum. They were the culmination of nearly 2 decades of being systematically marginalized, controlled, and emotionally abused. She arrived as a child bride, only to be publicly shunned in favor of her husband's lovers. She fulfilled her duty by providing an heir, only to have her children taken from her and her position and security stripped away by paranoid, greedy men. Her story is a stark illustration of the principle of action and reaction. The tyranny of Edward II and the Despensers created the very force that destroyed them. They showed Isabella no mercy, taught her that power was the only currency that mattered, and left her with no recourse but to play their game with even greater skill and ferocity. She learned her lessons well. In the brutal world of medieval power politics, she was an apt and brilliant pupil. Her legacy is not a simple one of villainy, but a deeply unsettling portrait of what can happen when a person's dignity is relentlessly attacked. The she-wolf was not born, she was made. She was crafted in the court of Edward II, shaped by contempt and tempered by fear, a living weapon that was ultimately turned back upon its own creators. Her life stands as a chilling and tragic monument to the cyclical nature of power and revenge, and a reminder that behind the grand tapestry of history lie the raw, bleeding, and intensely human dramas of survival.